Hello and welcome everyone to the PAMIC webinar, Sinkholes, an Insurance Industry Perspective, presented by Andy Muniz of Barry Isett and Associates. My name is Brittany Melnick and I'm the Director of Communications and Technology here at PAMIC. Before we begin today, I'd like to give a quick thank you to our sponsors, Baker Tilly, Donegal Insurance Group, Jen Ree, Guy Carpenter, Markham, Munich Re Hartford Steam Boiler, Mutual Boiler Re, Pennsylvania Lumbermen's Mutual, Swiss Re, and Willis Re. These platinum sponsors help sponsor all of our educational events as well as our webinars, and without them, our education would not be as successful as it is, so thank you so much to our sponsors. Just a quick reminder for you, if you do wish to sponsor our events for the 2020 year, if you wish to be an annual event sponsor, please do so by signing up on the PAMIC website. You can either sign up for our Flex sponsorships or our Platinum sponsorships, which do offer the most benefits out of our sponsorship package. Just a bit of information for this webinar. There is a question and answer section on the bottom of your screen. If you do happen to have any questions during the webinar itself, please feel free to write your name and email address within the question block, as well as the question itself, and Andy can get those answered for you as soon as he can. I will give Andy's contact information at the end of this presentation as well for any further questions that you may not think of during the webinar. Now to give a quick introduction of our speaker for the day, Andy Muniz. Andy Muniz is with Barry Isett and Associates and has been for over a decade. He has performed hundreds of structural and building envelope insurance assessments and has operated as the expert investigator on over 100 sinkhole cause and origin assessments and has designed repairs for most of those cases. With that introduction, I would like to hand over the presentation to Andy to give us a little more information on sinkholes and the insurance industry perspective. Andy?
All right. Thanks, Brittany, and thanks to PAMIC. We at Barry Isett decided to put this webinar together to help insurance adjusters primarily understand sinkholes. A little bit more background about Barry Isett and Associates. We are a multidiscipline engineer firm, so we do have a small forensics group that does interact with adjusters, but we have a deep field of engineers, geotechs, geologists, which kind of gives us a more unique perspective on sinkholes and their losses. We, as structural engineers, are very familiar with what can happen to a structure whenever a sinkhole occurs, but it's very important to have that depth in the geology and how sinkholes form, and geotechnical engineering and how to repair them before moving into a complex sinkhole loss. Without further ado, thanks again to PAMIC and Brittany. We're going to get into this webinar. Again, if you have any questions, you can find my contact information at the end. Just write them down and send them to me after the presentation, and I'll be happy to discuss anything. We developed this seminar mainly for adjusters. And primarily, we thought of this as a really good resource for adjusters that are not in sinkhole territories, but may get that occasional sinkhole loss because they are on the border between an area where there are no sinkholes, and then maybe they have a few policyholders that have this rider, and they don't often see these occurrences. So, an adjuster in the Lehigh Valley of Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton may have tons of these losses and really be familiar, but someone kind of on the borderline of that area may never see a loss or only occasionally see a sinkhole loss. So we wanted to try to clear up some of the questions surrounding like how a sinkhole forms, why it forms, and some of the misinformation that is out there. The big thing with misinformation is, you can see lots of videos and lots of people saying this is a sinkhole, or news reports saying this is a sinkhole, but was it actually a sinkhole? I just saw today on the news in my hometown of Pittsburgh said a sinkhole opened up and swallowed a bus, but was it really a sinkhole? I don't know. We're going to go through a couple little quick videos of some things that we see live and in person opening up, and just try to understand, is this thing that's occurring, is this actually a sinkhole opening, or is this some kind of other thing that's going on? You can see on the roadway there, the depression kind of starting to open up, in the car that is right next to it very wisely getting out of the way and probably honking its horn to try to get the other cars out of its way. So was this thing opening up actually a sinkhole? We're going to go through some causation case studies later on in the presentation to try to help you understand if these fantastic looking things are sinkholes, aren't sinkholes. The next one we're going to see, it has a little bit of audio. I hope it comes through, but if not, you can see this was in Baltimore, and YouTube said that this was a sinkhole. So yeah, between the two of those, one of those was not a sinkhole and one of those was a sinkhole. Despite being presented through news reports and online as being actually both sinkholes. Generally, this is a sinkhole definition that we use. It's pretty important to understand that your policy language may differ from this, but this is the geologic definition, and this is what we've been using for years to determine whether or not we are dealing with a sinkhole or some kind of other subsurface problem, which could be caused by any number of things. So it's the surface expression of subterranean collapse and or soil movement caused by the dissolution of carbonate rocks such as limestone or dolomite. Some policies may only say limestone, some may say limestone and dolomite, but the big thing is that carbonate rock thing. Carbonate just means that it's able to dissolve in water. So it's important to understand that, it's not just one exact type of rock that may form a sinkhole, but that is the definition that Barry Isett uses. So where do we find this limestone and dolomite rock? So, this is just a map of Pennsylvania, but you can imagine that this extends on down through into Maryland, West Virginia, up into New Jersey, and then some into Delaware. But you can see that there are quite a few bands across the middle of the state. You can also see that the area that I was talking about earlier in Pittsburgh that said this is a sinkhole, you can see that that is area underlined by flat-lying, generally thin, but locally thick limestone beds, which are discontinuous in places and are commonly interbedded with shale. So in Pittsburgh, could be a sinkhole. It absolutely could be, but it's much more likely to find those kind of formations whenever you run into the areas where you see the darker shading on the map, which is definitely limestone, definitely dolomite, and usually are pretty close to the surface and can cause sinkholes. So again, what we talked about earlier is the two things that you are going to need to cause a sinkhole is first is a carbonate bedrock, that's the limestone and dolomite, but to actually get it to dissolve in water, you need the water. That is what actually opens these caverns under the subsurface. So these are the two pieces that we are looking for whenever we're trying to say, okay, what caused this feature to open? First, we have to find out if there is actually rock there, and then we're going to look at what are our potential water sources. So whenever we look at these formations on a map, they're just like mapped out, but if you would just cut a cross section through, you can see that it's not as simple as just a big chunk of rock underneath the surface that is totally uniform, no joints or bedding planes, but that's what you can see in this. When you cut a cross section of this rock, the bedding planes those are the horizontal lines, and the joints those are the vertical lines. And both of those features can cause water to move through the rock in unique and novel ways and find areas where it might want to pool and start to collect. And that's usually where you start to see the formation of sinkholes or caverns, is areas where this water wants to pool, it wants to collect, and it can slowly dissolve over many years, sometimes thousands of years, to cause openings in this rock surface and then cause the sinkhole on the overlying soil burden. So if you want to see a cartoon of what that would look like, this is that same photo turned into a cartoon just showing how water would move from the surface down through joints and then across bedding planes. And then you could imagine if one of those bedding planes was a little bowl shaped, it might collect some water and cause faster dissolution of the carbonate bedrock. So sometimes it is not always just normally oriented bedding planes that are always completely horizontal. You can see that this one is completely turned vertically. We are looking down into the tops of the rocks, and you can see the person's foot there kind of showing that they're standing on top of this, but that right there is a bedding plane that has been turned vertically. That just happens over many millions of years of the rock just turning and shifting under the Earth's surface. So it's not always very simple in which the patterns in which the water is going to find its way down into the subsurface. So sometimes you have to be very careful to understand that it's not very simple once you get underneath the Earth, which way the water is going to go. So what is the sinkhole that we see at the surface? The very classic definition where most people think, oh, I know what a sinkhole looks like. That's the dirt that's disappeared into the earth and it opens up that circular depression. And I know what that looks like at the surface. Well, that is what occurs whenever you have soil piping. So you can see all these pipe networks in the soil. And what that really is trying to depict in this cartoon is pretend that that big pipe at the bottom is the rock surface that has opened up a cavern. And that cavern has opened up because of a sinkhole. It's dissolved the rock over many thousands of years. But the more sudden event that happens at the surface is soil piping has collapsed the soil down in through these networks, through water flow down into that cavern. So that's kind of what we typically see as the kind of end cause of the end result of a sinkhole. It's not that the soil is the sinkhole, it's that the soil has disappeared down into some cavern feature that has opened up in that carbonate bedrock. So what does that look like in practice? Here's an excavation that was performed after a sinkhole was discovered. And then we dug down to do the remediation portion. And that's typically what you would see is some portion of soil that is slightly denser around the opening, but you can see it chases back in. And if we would take that soil probe that's in the front of that photo and just kind of push it back into that hole, you would see that that soil pipe would eventually find its way back to a cavern that has opened up over many thousands of years. So when you zoom even further out, you can see that topography in areas that are sinkhole prone, when you look from even high up in a helicopter or plane, you can start to see these little depressions. And I'll put my arrow on the photo here and show you. You can see that these depressions are forming in the surface. And once they start to form, those things, they kind of are a self-fulfilling prophecy. They kind of, as they collect more water and dissolve and soil pipe that water down into the cavern, they start to form more of a bowl at the surface. And then when they form more of a bowl at the surface, some depression, more water gets attracted there, and it pushes more soil through that soil piping mechanism down into the cavern and makes it even bigger. So these things tend to accelerate over time, even though caverns take many thousands of years to potentially open. The effects of where that soil goes can happen fairly quickly over the course of months, weeks, days, and even in the case of some like water main breaks or big water sources such as a pool, they could open in minutes. So even though it is a geologic scale of many thousands of years, sometimes the soil can see the difference within a couple minutes even. So whenever you talk about what it looks like below the surface, because we were just talking about all the effects that happen to the soil, what happens if you would strip away all the soil? What does it look like? And here's a very drastic example. You can see there's a gentleman down in that excavation right there, and he's walking through all this very pinnacled bedrock. And as we talked about earlier, it's not always very simple that bedrock is laid completely flat. and it's just really uniform. This is an example where rock was probably turned vertically and then eroded over many thousands of years of water transfer through that medium, and just causing all of these very sharp pinnacles, which can sometimes enhance the effects of water getting to sinkhole prone areas, because a pinnacle is just like kind of a funnel, and it might direct water to one zone that's a little more susceptible to sinkhole formation. And again, this is kind of a cartoon showing what that soil piping and like depression starting to grow a little bit deeper, attracting more water, growing even deeper, collapsing down the soil, and then eventually just washing completely out into the underlying rock. So that's kind of showing from A to E, just kind of the process. Originally, there's nothing wrong at the surface. You can't see anything. And B, you can start to see, oh, wow, there's a little bit of a depression here. Maybe something's going on under the surface. And then in C, it's like, yes, there is definitely something going on the surface. This depression is growing quickly. And then in D and E, that's where finally it's like you might get the insurance claim, I have a sinkhole. So it might be A, B, and C have happened over 3 or 4 years, and then D and E happens suddenly. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, we definitely have a sinkhole here. And then they put in their insurance claim. This is what like that last cartoon would look like if you could just cut away all the side of the soil to see what an actual sinkhole live would look like. There would have been, you know, a cavern below this, and you can see all the soil kind of washing down into that area and spilling out in kind of an hourglass shape. And that's kind of the very classic sinkhole formation shape. You have the hourglass of at the top, the surface is wider. It goes through a narrow choke point. That's where the top of the roof of the cavern is. And then the soil washes out down into the cavern that's been created. So sometimes whenever you're driving around the Lehigh Valley and you can see all these farm fields, you can look around for what we call ghost lakes. They sometimes portend the beginning of a sinkhole, you know, just areas where water has pooled like much more than other areas, starting to form that depression, allowing that water to go down in, maybe getting a little more depressed. And if you're driving around the farm country of, you know, Lancaster, Lehigh Valley, all the way up into New Jersey, very often you'll see these farm fields with either ghost lakes like this, or something that has gone on long enough and opened up a cavern and pulled the soil down in, where for no other explanation, you'll just see an untended portion of a farm field. It'll just be nice farm field everywhere else. And then somewhere in the middle, there's just, you know, brush and maybe a couple smaller trees, and they just don't farm in that area. That could be that there was a sinkhole there and they just weren't able to farm it. Just they couldn't keep the soil to stay there. It was just always washing out. So they just abandoned that small portion of their field. So something to look around whenever you're driving around, especially like the Route 222 corridor or Route 78. Sometimes those areas are very prone to sinkhole activity. So here's a pool liner. You know, you just see like a very subtle depression. You might have got a claim like this where it's like, I have something wrong with my pool. What's going on underneath? It's really hard to tell without removing the pool liner what is going on underneath. It could be that they just didn't compact it well enough in some certain area, or something happened very locally. Or it could be that whenever you pull back the liner to try to get an understanding, that there is actually a sinkhole, and you can see the quite a bit of depression that's going on there, and then just a little bit of excavation, and very quickly you can see it's opened up into a pretty large soil pipe. And then on the left, or on the very far right, you can see that not very far into the surface, there was one of those pinnacles of limestone very, very close to the surface, and very, very close to the bed of that pool. So probably wasn't pool water that was getting in, because it didn't look like that liner was breached. But even just a little bit of water through the surface along the edge of the pool from rain and things like that could have contributed to this event. So we're going to scroll through a couple photos of jobs that Barry Isett has done over the years of just like very classic looking sinkholes. It's really important to remember that not everything looks classic. Sometimes things are hidden, and we're going to get into that a little bit with some case studies when they don't look so classic. But these are some of the worst ones that we've come across over the many decades that we've been doing this work. Since we started in the Lehigh Valley, we are now like an entirely eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware company as of now. But we primarily started back in 1977 in the Lehigh Valley. So we've been doing sinkholes for a long time just because they're so prevalent in this area. This one here was in Easton. Very big loss. Lots of different insurance companies involved. And, a lot of considerations went into this loss. Just, what caused the water main to rupture? Was a sinkhole first and then the water main ruptured, or was the water main deteriorated and old and should have been replaced, and that's what caused the rupture? And then once that happened, it just exacerbated like a underlying condition of a sinkhole. So it's really hard to figure that out sometimes. You might ask that question of your engineers, your forensic engineers and your geologists and your geotechs, but it's important to remember that causation is a tricky thing when you're talking about sinkholes. It's not always the case where you're just going to find some smoking gun and say, oh yeah, it was the water main that was corroded and that's what broke first. It's kind of a chicken or the egg argument at times. Another sinkhole we dealt with, you can see the piping on the right. What we found in this case was they had fit all those stormwater pipes together, but never actually finished the glue off. They didn't glue them. They just fit them together rough, and it caused one of them to separate and just allow water to just pour into the subsurface for many years until this opened up. All right, so we're going to get into what is the purpose of an investigation. And we are going to focus this on for the insurance industry, because very often we're asked to do this for private clients and they don't have insurance and they just want to keep things moving. But in the insurance investigation, most importantly, it's causation first. We want to figure out what caused this, because there's many other things that can cause openings in the surface. I mean, even the ones that I just showed you, they all look very classically like sinkholes, but there are other things that could cause that kind of damage. Next, we're going to determine the extent of damage. And always, we have to generate conceptual recommendations for repair, because it's really hard for an adjuster to, say, how much is this going to cost? It's really a complicated subject. It's not as simple as whenever a car hits a building, you can just sum up the parts and say, here's what it costs. And then finally, we always, on any of our site visits, whether it be sinkhole or car impact or whatever, we're looking for safety first. And it's been a number of times where I've been put in the hard position of, having people have to leave their home. Even I remember the one I did was the day before Thanksgiving, saying their house was unsafe. So we're always looking towards that and kind of, giving the insurance company an added level of security in that regard. It's like when they turn that over to an expert, it's like they're taking on that liability. And we usually transfer that over to municipalities, let them know like, hey, this is an unsafe condition before we, get ourselves into the insurance portions of it. So safety always comes first. So here are the components of the investigation. And this is why it's important to consider what expert you're hiring more than just one structural engineer, because reviewing site geology and site history, that is something that, even though I am very experienced, I've done this for more than a decade now, we do want to have that geologist be the person that is the expert, and they can bring that expertise to say, is this actually sinkhole territory or not? Is this rock actually part of like a condition that could cause a sinkhole, or is it not? Having that expert do that piece of it while I handle the structure is kind of a really big asset to have, especially if these things end up in litigation, which, given the costs of repairing some of these, sometimes they do. Next, we conduct a site walk to observe the actual conditions. And then finally, sometimes, that's not enough. We didn't get enough information from the surface. We need to go subsurface. And we'll get into some of those, but they can include an excavation, geophysical survey, or an actual geotechnical boring to kind of get under the surface. So first step, just doing the geologic history and sinkhole maps. There's a lot of limestone and carbonate rock maps. You can just pull up these maps and look and see where they end and start. And when the underlying rock is mapped, it's not exact, but there are lines drawn on a map, but it is so close that sometimes, I'll show you on the next slide, you can see that subject site in the top left corner there. Within a block or 2 blocks, you are between, one formation to another formation, the Rickenbach, and then finally to the Allentown formation. So it's amazing that within a couple blocks, these things can change. So that's why it's important to have the expert that not only can see those maps, but understand what the significance and the tolerance on those maps are. Because it might be so close, and they might have an understanding that, we can't pinpoint it, and we need to do more information to understand what rock is underlying this. Another type of map that was devised in the early, I think, 40s and 50s is, it's called a historic sinkhole map. And what it was a gentleman, geologist, took all these aerial photographs and just mapped closed depressions. If you can remember that aerial photograph of land, and I was pointing out where the depressions were, this is basically what he was doing, and he was actually mapping these things out. So these maps exist, and correlating them with your site can help you understand, okay, how many closed depressions, how prone is this area to sinkholes? Because it's not just one thing to have, sinkhole prone rock. You have to actually prove that, yes, closed depressions and sinkholes actually do open up in this rock. Sometimes rock is so deep that it just doesn't open up. You could have sinkhole prone rock that's 300 feet deep. It's just not going to cause any problems at the surface. But depending on its proximity to the surface, it can cause big problems. So that map is very important to consider whenever you are, mapping out your site and figuring out how sinkhole prone an area is. So after you've done the site geology and the history, sinkhole history, you can take into account any other history that a owner might give you. Was there any mining in the area? What's the chronology of events? What happened on this site? Just kind of gather up that information, because sometimes it's very important to kind of understand, what was done. So it's like you can see that on this site, there's a 1 call that was marked out. What was that marked out for? You might get some information from the homeowner. Oh yeah, they just dug a new sewer right across the way, or they just changed the stormwater basin. It might have redirected some water that came more towards that area. So it's important to kind of consider those things, even though they may be hearsay, but you can put them kind of in your notes and just keep them in reference as you look around the site for more information. As I said earlier, is like, was there recent stormwater work? That's very often the case. Is stormwater changes across a site can cause, big problems down the line. So always try to gather that information. Did you put in a pool? Did they change the stormwater? Did they do repairs in the street? Was anyone working in the street? Did your water shut off, or did anything happen like that? It's important to keep in mind as you do the investigation. So after you've done that, you've gathered the information from the maps and from the homeowner or any relevant party. The next part is the visual observations. This is a site visit to come out and see if this is actually a surface subsidence or there's actually a deeper issue. So we're always looking for correlations between structural damage and like actual subsidence. And we're also always looking for that source of water because, it could be as simple as just water running off the side of a driveway, but it could be as bad as they had a pool and it opened up and allowed a bunch of water in to make the situation worse. So here's an example of, is this a deeper issue or is this just surface settlement, some settlement after construction? You can tell by the look of that driveway that this home is not that old. And basically, whenever you see a home of this age, you always have your eye out for things that are just settling after construction. The excavation around the house, the excavation for trenches. And you can see on this one that there's kind of a linear depression across this driveway. It's trending in a line across that driveway. And so we thought, wow, that looks a little too convenient that it's in a line. It's not very often that sinkholes would open in a very linear fashion. Very typically, they open in that kind of hourglass shape, and at the surface, you see more of a circular pattern. So we decided to camera. You can see on the right, we have a scope camera that can camera the underground sewer line, and we cameraed that with it's called a sanitary lateral inspection camera. And then you can see in this next slide the photos of that sanitary line trended right in the direction of that depression, but inside the sanitary line was in completely good condition. There was nothing wrong with it. There was no water going out. So it was confirmed that this one was just the trench that was dug for that pipe. And then they backfilled it and didn't do enough job compacting the fill over it. So in a new home, you can expect this thing to settle a little bit over the course of, 3, 4, 5 years. So that's what this homeowner was dealing with. So this was not a sinkhole. Another question we ask when we're looking for, is this surface subsidence or is it a deeper issue, is what is the volume of soil loss? If it's just a small amount of soil loss, it could just be that soil is compressing. In the case on this left side, you've got one sidewalk panel settling 1 inch. That is easily explained by, whenever they backfilled this area, they didn't compress it enough and it's just compressed slowly over time. On the right, you can see that's 3 inches and it's a whole garage bay. So you can imagine that would take a ton of compression to actually make that happen, which is not something that would happen in a garage normally. And especially that home on the right, I was the one that assessed that one. It just, like, the home was built in 1985. It had undergone no damage, and all of a sudden we have all this fresh damage in a whole garage bay, sinks 3 inches. So this was clearly, even though we didn't have that very classic circular opening on the surface, it was clearly a sinkhole. So again, we sometimes look for correlation between structural damage and what we're seeing on the site. So you can see in this one where that arrow is, that's like the way that other picture is taken. And you can see that arrow is chasing back towards the house. That's the direction that hole was chasing. So when you look down in that hole, it wasn't just going straight down. It was actually kind of arcing towards the house, towards the garage of the house. And then on the right, or on the rear wall of the house, there's a crack that's like on the far side of where all this movement and damage is, like, all to the soil is concerned. So was this consistent? Was that crack consistent with damage going on at the front left corner of the house and this crack at the right rear corner of the house? We called that not consistent. Whereas this is at the left side of the garage. This crack in the left wall is exactly where that hole is trending. It's obviously very big. It's obviously very fresh. We called this actual damage from the sinkhole. So it's important to say, we're going to draw the line somewhere and say what was actually damaged by the sinkhole, and not just find every single crack in the home and say, okay, they're all caused by this sinkhole. So it's important to kind of figure out which way the damage the subsurface is going, and try to correlate that with what is going on with the structure. So again, we're always trying to look for the water and the natural way that water is going, whether it be through natural features, stormwater runoff, or whether it be through utilities and grading. Just any way that, like a utility exiting the house, the sanitary lateral, every time they flush the toilet or take a shower, if that is broken, that could be a problem. So that's why we try to camera those. If the roof leaders come off the house and they go under grade and we don't know where they come out, that's an important thing to look into. It's really hard to say what the cause of the sinkhole is 100%, but water is always going to be a contributory factor. And you might not always be able to identify exactly where the water was, but it's always a good process to keep that in your investigation and not just think of it structurally and just have a structural engineer identify, the 5 things that were damaged on the site. So here's a case where a sanitary lateral is broken and just voiding out the soil for probably many months before it was discovered. So that's a case where, investigating that was important. So different sources of water and what they can cause, and whether one's accelerated settlement or one is severe soil loss, is kind of the difference between, is this actually a sinkhole or is this actually just settlement of soil that would happen whether you were in sinkhole territory or not. On the left, you can see that water discharging from the roof leader is in that one zone. And even though it is a little depressed there, and you can see that soil probe just goes right into the soil very easily, it's not a sinkhole unless it's actually opened some kind of cavern in the bedrock, and then that soil has disappeared. This is just some settlement that's going to be accelerated by the water that's in that area. Whereas on the right, that's not settlement, that is loss. Like that soil had to go somewhere to cause that damage. So the difference between the two of them is pretty important. So the last investigation step we have is like subsurface investigations, whether you're actually probing the subsurface with an excavation or a geotechnical boring, or you're doing non-destructive, non-invasive testing like geophysical surveys. So we'll start with the excavation and test pits and why they can help you understand what's going on. This wasn't an actual excavation because it actually just looked like this when we showed up to the site visit first, but it's important to kind of understand that everything that looks like a sinkhole is a sinkhole. You can see that on the left, whenever you first show up, it kind of looks like a sinkhole. It's very round at the surface, but whenever you look a little further down into there, you can see that there's water standing in the base of the trench, which is kind of weird that's like water doesn't normally sit in a sinkhole. Normally it's washed out the soil and caused that issue to form in the first place, so the water would just go. And then also there's a structure down there, and what this was a roof of an old cistern. So it's kind of sometimes these old cisterns give way and they really look like a classic sinkhole, but they are not. They are just a collapse of a subsurface feature, which would be a man-made feature. So here's another one. We had a 3-foot wide depression with soft soils in that area. And we were wondering, wow, it really looks like a sinkhole. It's right in line with the sanitary line. Maybe the sanitary line's cracked. But we said, let's do an investigation a little further before we call it a sinkhole. It was in sinkhole territory. So we decided, insurance company agreed, let's do a little excavation. Let's see what's going on. And what it turned out is it was an abandoned septic tank. So it had all the characteristics of a sinkhole, but we just did a little bit of an excavation, and then turns out it wasn't. It was an abandoned septic tank that just never got properly filled, and then it collapsed. Another one, which it looked very classic, like a sinkhole. I mean, that last one, maybe it didn't look like a sinkhole, but this one, you show up to a site and it really starts to look like a sinkhole. You got an open void. It's like chasing down into the rock. Like like what could this be other than a sinkhole? But once you did an excavation, it uncovered a abandoned root cellar that had, the roof had collapsed, pulled soil down with it, and that was what was going on with this one. So first things that look like a sinkhole, if you just do a little further investigation, spend a little bit more time on the case before trying to close it, you might figure out are not actually sinkholes. So geophysics is just non-invasive testing. There's many different ways that you can perform geophysics. We'll just cover a few of them just to kind of give you an idea of what they might be used for. The main reasons why we use geophysics are mainly because we're not able to get enough information from the subsurface. Maybe it's covered with, like structures, slabs, pools, things that are like just completely obstructing the view of the surface. Also another reason we would do them is just the subsidence covers a very large area. Maybe it's in the front of the house, and in the back of the house, and the side of the house, and you're just trying to get an understanding of where the actual root of the problem is. And then sometimes we might want to do borings like excavation or something, but it's just not possible for access. You can't get the machinery back there. So geophysics can help with those cases. So microgravity is one of the cases we use, and it's just a very finely tuned instrument that just calculates, the position of the moon, and it calculates everything that could possibly be affecting the gravity at this instrument, and it just moves it around the site, and you can see where there is more and less gravity in a certain location pulling up from below the instrument. So what it does is you can see if there's voiding, or maybe more soil or more rock, and that's what that colored map is if this is red is low gravity and blue is high gravity, or vice versa. You can kind of get an understanding of where those low gravity spots might be. It's always important to kind of correlate that with other types of investigation. It might not be that microgravity says, oh, there's a void underneath there. It could just be that the rock is very steeply dipped, and rock weighs more than soil. So it's important to keep that in mind, that one type of geophysical survey is not good. You want to correlate that with some other ones. Like they do seismic refraction just to understand the level of the bedrock. That might be another method that could be used. So another subsurface investigation we can do is geotechnical borings. Some examples of when that might be necessary. Whenever geophysics are not conclusive, very often, you think you're going to get some really good information, but it's kind of contradictory. So it's important to confirm with some boring information, like what they are seeing out there. And sometimes the geophysicists really like to see that. They like to understand where the borings return certain information so they can refine their data. Another reason is like if the subsidence is in a specific area, but the damage and site expressions, like damage to the structure, just aren't definitive. You have some stuff that might be old damage or new damage, or it's really kind of could be multiple causes. And then another reason to do these is if the subsidence area is like completely covered, again, covered by slabs, structures, whatever. You can do a boring and kind of get more information. So it's really important to remember that whenever you're doing these borings, the information you're going to get is going to be very precise. You're going to know exactly, was it voided? What kind of soil was there? What kind of rock was there? But you're looking through a pinhole. You're looking through one specific point, and maybe up to like 3 or 4, depending on how many borings you get in. Those are just in those locations. You could move 10 feet to the left or right, and maybe it's very different. So it's important to know that that's not always going to get you super definitive information across the entire site. All right, so you got a sinkhole. Now what do? Pretend we've went through all that, and yes, it's a sinkhole. Yes, it's covered. These things can cost a lot of money. So you just don't want to start throwing that money down the hole until you take care of it. you want to understand as best you can what the extent of damage is and how much you have to do to repair it, which is it's a complicated thing. And this is where the importance of that team approach I mentioned earlier really comes into play. It's really good to have not only a structural engineer, but a geotech and geologist, at least on the staff of who you've hired. Maybe you can just send out one of them, but they have to have those extra resources. A great example of this is I was involved on a non-mutual insurance company claim that they had hired a geologist to come out and say, was there a sinkhole? And the geologist did a great job in geology. He came out and said, yes, it's a sinkhole, and yes, here's how you repair the subsurface. But he didn't really assess the structure well enough. And when they got into repairing this sinkhole, the contractor got about halfway through and said, hold on, something's wrong here, insurance company. Like, the structure is like really damaged, really bowing. And then so the insurance company contacted us, said, yeah, we're sorry. Like we messed up on this one. It seems that we didn't get a structural engineer to review the structure. Can you go out and take a look at this? So we went out and took a look, and it turned out that the wall that was underneath the sinkhole had bowed to the point where all the joists, all the wooden joists that were pocketing in this masonry wall had pulled out of the wall, and the bedroom in which their insured were sleeping was completely unsupported. It was basically the joists were sitting on 1/4-inch thick Luan panels. That's what was holding up their bedroom, and it was just amazing that it had stood until then. There's another case. Okay, everyone has to leave the home. You can't live here anymore. And it was a lot more expensive to fix it than State Farm had initially thought. So that's why I always try to stress this team approach. It might look a lot more expensive to investigate these things, but it's going to save you some really big heartache down the road if you've got a good team in place at the beginning. So, when we talk about like methods of repair, one thing that we can do to try to repair these sinkholes is excavation and underpinning. It's the kind of brute force. Let's just come in there and just dig down until we find the problem, and we'll underpin the foundation as we go, because we don't want to dig down underneath the foundation. That would be problematic. So you do it in sections and slowly reinstall pieces of the foundation as you dig down. This is generally a good idea if you aren't really close to the building foundation, or you don't have a giant sinkhole that might just start to get big. Because if you start trying to do this right up against the foundation and it's going to go deep, the underpinning costs can go through the roof. So it's really important to have the team in place that kind of understands the differences between those two nuances and understand which direction it could go for repairs. So, here's just like a picture of like what the underpinning would look like. You dig down and then you pour, and then you move over and dig down and then you pour some more. Backfilling an area when you're done, this is like one of the big important things, is to have that team in place, is because, I've overseen a lot of structural repairs, but as far as like backfilling repairs, it's really important to have that backup of a geologist behind me that is going to understand the proper way to do this, because as you dig down, you might see different things that make you think, okay, what's the right way to repair this? Backfilling, the way we do it, Barry Isett, is using native soils that have enough clay content to kind of shed the water. And then we use a bentonite clay. It's just a desiccate that kind of like sheds water even more, decreases the permeability of that soil, limiting water to go back into that zone. And you can see a little cartoon of what that would look like. Just intermittent layers of soil, clay soil, and bentonite just as you come up, and then creating a cap to kind of shed the water away, just sloping it away from the old problem area, which you can see is that like depicted as that brickwork hole. That would have been the sinkhole. And then you dig down, find the root of the cause, and then just repair it as if it was kind of like a tooth decay. So here's like what it looks like when you're mixing that bentonite in with the soil. It's not a lot of it, but it is that white substance, and it kind of helps prevent that water from being so permeable right through the soil and going right back to the root of the problem again. This is just like a compactor like that the contractors use. We try to stabilize them in small lifts so that it doesn't resettle again and cause that kind of bathtub effect and allow water to come back to that area. So another method of repair is pressure grouting. So whenever you're doing the surface repair and it's not too close to a residential foundation or it hasn't caused structural damage, that's fine. But if it's really close to the foundation or it's caused structural damage, it's really important to consider this as a repair method. What pressure grouting does is it improves the soil bearing capacity. It consolidates loose soils and it stabilizes and supports foundations. But it's really important that even though it seals channels within soil rock, it's only doing right at the point that they've drilled. So really what we're trying to do is stabilize this soil and pressurize it to kind of re-achieve the normal bearing capacity of that soil from the rock up. So here's what pressure grouting looks like. You can see they kind of make a mess of the site. They drive this big rig in there and they drill a bunch of holes. They have to tarp off the house so they don't get grout all over the siding and stuff. So it can be pretty invasive and it's pretty extensive. So it gets a little bit more expensive than just a simple excavation fix, but it is really important if you're dealing with actual structural movement of foundations. So as I said, again, it can be very invasive. You can see this is going on inside a pool. This pool, I think, had a collapse. It might have even been the one from earlier where we had the liner cut away and then you found the sinkhole. Now we're going in to actually repair this so that it doesn't open up again. And with a big water source like the pool, it's like you can't really leave it to chance and say, oh, I think it'll be fine. It's not going to open up again. With that much water there, it's a very big potential to cause a little bit of a depression, open up the liner, and collapse again. So there's like a kind of a cross section of what pressure grouting looks like. Each of those zones, like each of these zones, I'll point with my arrow again. This is where the drills would have went down. And you can see that when they inject the grout, it causes the soil to push outwards and cause these bulbs of grout to like kind of push outwards. And this whole hatched area above is what we're assuming is the improved soil bearing zone to kind of really help the foundations above, bridge any gaps that might be in the rock below down here. So that's a little into the weeds on pressure grouting and what that looks like, but it's more of an art than a science. But you definitely want to have like a really competent engineer oversee that. A lot of times we get involved in claims and it's like, oh, this is our cap of of what we cover, and we don't cover the engineer to be out there. It's really short-sighted, I think, on a lot of insurance companies' parts to not just cover the engineer to be out there, because what could happen is another sinkhole opens up in a year because it didn't get repaired properly, it didn't get taken care of properly, and it didn't really adequately protect that site from seeing another loss and another claim, more repairs. Very often we're involved in ones where, they tried to repair it without an engineer involved once, they tried to repair it without an engineer involved twice, and we're out there for the third time, and it's really costly for insurance companies to go through that cycle. So one of the most expensive and complicated repairs that we could go through is micropiling a house. We don't often get to this level just because it is pretty expensive, but sometimes sites are just so sinkhole prone and they're so problematic that this is what it takes. And what it involves is, you can see on the right of those brackets, they get clipped to the foundation of the house, and those pipes on the left, those are what gets drilled down into the surface until they reach bedrock. So that's the brackets getting installed on the house. They cut off the toe of the foundation and install the bracket, and then they come in with their rig and drill those down onto bedrock. So then it just kind of bypasses the soil and allows the residents to kind of be supported by those piles directly. So another method of repair, usually this is almost on every single one we're doing, is like, cracking in a foundation wall. We do want to support the soil, but the cracking in the foundation wall needs to be taken care of. If it's a 1/4 inch wide or so, usually those things can be epoxy injected. That makes it even stronger than it was before the crack occurred. Wider cracking, that might take some reinforcing bars, like when you see at this corner, this big crack that's opened up here, that might require cutting out a piece of that and installing some reinforcing bars across that joint to like kind of stabilize that crack before it gets reformed and poured. That's another one where it's like that, structural epoxy is not going to work on that crack. It's too big. So that's going to involve cutting out pieces of the wall, pulling those down, replacing them, so that it can sometimes get pretty extensive depending on the amount of movement that is seen. So in addition to all those repair methods, it's really important to remember, even if, as an insurance company, you aren't covering these things, it's really important to remember, like, these are the best practices to convey to your insured that they do to prevent future opening of sinkholes or future problems. And that's just kind of all leading back to the first thing we talked about, which is water. You have this carbonate rock. We've already determined that at your site. But the last thing that it needs is more water to form a sinkhole. So you're just taking care of all of your water-bearing underground utilities. That's, water laterals, sewer laterals, roof leaders, just making sure they're intact, conveying to the insured or testing that, make sure that they get camera surveyed, rerouting rain leaders away from foundations, regrading slope away from foundations, and sloping impervious pavements away from the structure, just getting that water to be somewhere other than right underneath their residence. Those are really good practices to just keep in mind as like you kind of wrap up these claims to just convey to your insureds. It's like, look, we've went through this big costly repair. It was probably a big headache for them. It was a big headache for us. Here's some really best methods to prevent this from ever happening again. So, it's like a lot of times those things just get brushed over. And I think that it's really important to keep them in mind as you go forward, like with these claims and wrapping them up and just finding some way to convey that to the insured. We always do that in our reports as a really important way to like say, okay, this is the way you prevent this from happening again in the future. And with that, like, we're at the end. So again, there's my contact information. If you have any questions for me, you can call me, email me. If you had anything written down over the course of the presentation, just go ahead, shoot an email over to me. We'll talk it through. If it's more intensive of a conversation, I have geologists and geotechnical engineers at my firm. We can loop them into the conversation, but we'd happy to talk about that more, and hope to see you at the PAMIC Claims Summit and at future events. Thanks a lot.
All right, well, thank you so much, Andy, for presenting this topic for us, and thank you everyone for attending. If you do wish to rewatch this webinar, it will be live on the on-demand section under the PAMIC website, pamic.org. Feel free to rewatch whenever, and if you have any further questions, Andy's contact information will also be provided. As we conclude this webinar, I hope the rest of you have a fantastic holiday season, and we look forward to seeing you at the next PAMIC event or webinar. Have a great day.